Okay, I think we are underway now. This is a little unnerving, to be honest, because I can't see people out in the audience, but I'm going to presume, I'm going to have faith that you are there. And through an act of faith, I suppose I'll say hello, everybody. My name is Jerry White. I am the chair of the Research, Scholarly, and Artistic Work Committee of the Department of English at the University of Saskatchewan. University of Saskatchewan is, as folks will know, situated on the territory of Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis, two solemn and territorial realities that are part of a living constitutional tradition, which is itself anchored in a global political framework shored up by the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which we expect to hear more about from our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Len Findlay. No stranger to the audience that I still am making an act of faith is out there. Len Findlay is, of course, a distinguished university professor emeritus, a founding and ongoing member of the Indigenous Humanities group at the U of S, and the recipient of two USSU teaching awards. He directed the Humanities Research Unit at the U of S from its inception until its demise. He's also past president of Academy One, the Arts and Humanities Academy of the Royal Society of Canada. He's president of Acute and vice president external of the Canadian Federation of the Humanities. Past president of Acute, past vice president external of the Canadian Federation of the Humanities, and a two-term chair of CAUT's Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee, in addition to being an ongoing member of the board of directors of the Harry Crow Foundation for Academic Freedom and an ongoing senior fellow at Ryerson University's Center for Free Expression. He was a visiting research fellow at Western's Center for Theory and Criticism, as well as the Fry Professor at the University of Toronto. He's also served for 3 years as the Senior Policy Analyst in the Universities branch of the Department of Post-Secondary Education in Regina during Roy Romano's NDP government. He is both proud and rueful that none of the 5 Saskatchewan ministers of post-secondary education for whom he wrote speeches ever delivered one verbatim. So, right. It's the pain, the exquisite pain of the speechwriter, I suppose. As an academic activist, Len, for several decades, has worked as both an outsider and an insider, understanding organizational and power structures in order to make them more socially inclusive and imaginative in their understanding and fulfillment of their mandates. In this regard, his defeats and disappointments are numerous, but he has been fortified by priceless mentors and allies, prominent among these, of course, the late Peter Millard. And he finds that his extended areas to subversion delivered at Little Bear Lake before an audience to die for or to die by, including Bob Calder and Dave Carpenter, he finds all of this mysteriously restorative. May ye, and I'm quoting verbatim from the text there, so may ye on this webinar today prove equally inspiring and challenging. Trained in 19th century European elite and radical cultural theory and production, Len's more recent Canadianist work engages with the Indigenous settler interface, historically and currently, the distinctiveness and endangerment of the humanities in Canada, and with connections and tensions between academic freedom and the decolonization of Canadian universities. His edition and revised tradition of the Communist Manifesto is still selling quite well. I'll leave the ironic comments to the side for now, domestically and internationally, into its 8,000, while his edition of Swinburne sells steadily with Routledge. As for his other 3 edited or co-edited collections, and not so much interest these days, while the picture is decidedly mixed for the more than 100 book chapters and journal articles he's published, and the more than 50 academic book reviews in terms of circulation and reprints. However, he does not closely follow, far less obsess about such matters. I trust it goes without saying. Instead, he continues to write about what interests him and looks forward to reactions to 2 new chapters exploring Canada as the product of a distinctive dialectic between a feral culture and a federal state. Say that 10 times fast, if you will. In his long career at the University of Saskatchewan, he served twice on the executive of the Faculty Association and, like Peter Millard himself, 1 year as chair. Len continues to be an active supporter of Faculty for Palestine and Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. He has not set foot in the United States since September 11th, 2001, and the subsequent censoring of a piece he wrote on that horrifying event at the invitation of an American journal is something that remains in his memory. Len continues to find pleasure and energy aplenty in the achievements of former students, in irrepressible seniors like the late Stefan Hessel, who produced work like Indignez-vous from 2010, Time for Outrage, in rereading the literary and Marxist canons, and in the indefatigable social justice work of his life partner, Isabel. So with the happy knowledge that I have read a beautifully produced speech verbatim, I'm going to turn the floor over to Len Findlay, who will deliver this year's Peter Millard Lecture. So Len, à vous.
Touché, and thank you, Jerry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Up front, let me say that I will be producing a text, finalizing a text after today's session. And if you want a copy of that, just email me. And once I've got it in good order, it will be going into the Peter Millard fonts at the University Archives and into my fonts at the University Archives. And this little billet-doux from me to the English department for memory's sake. So don't get into any frantic stenographic activity today. Just think about challenges and think about questions. And if you want to see my text, all you need to do is email me and I will happily send it to you. Well, academic activism after Stonewall, after UNDRIP, and after COVID. Here on Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis, foundational colonial injustices have long been compounded by other forms of bigotry and violence directed at women, people with disabilities, physical and mental, the wrong sort of immigrants with the wrong religious affiliations, and many, many more. Sad to say, but not at all surprising given how systemic injustice works. Key institutions, universities included, have abetted wrongdoing directly and indirectly to placate and protect dominant groups in society. Historically, universities have been part of the problem, and intermittently, and with varying degrees of reluctance and success, they have been a part of the solution. In this talk, I will examine a few episodes in this mixed history, murky present, and uncertain future, and will endeavor to do so in the spirit and primarily within a framed portrait of Peter Millard, after whom this lecture series is named, and in whose debt the University and Province of Saskatchewan remain. I worry about my ability to do justice to Peter and to my chosen topic, and on Zoom instead of in a room, but it could be worse. I could be dancing or rapping my PhD. My regular appearances on Zoom this past year have been nerve-wracking and mostly disappointing. But I'll do my best today while deeply grateful to those who have enabled this event and those tuned in from who knows where for my unforgiving countenance and even more for my unforgiving prose. Don't give them your granite face, Dad, as my kids would say. I'll try not to. Let me begin with a disavowal. I do not have the archival expertise of the late Neil Richards, who did so much to build the U of S collections around and relating to the Pink Prairies. Nor do I have the command of LGBTQ2S+ issues of our fine colleague, Valerie Kornick. What I would claim is a critical knowledge of how universities work in order to preserve conveniently inaccurate illusions about their own progressiveness and how they have reacted to different waves of change in a predictable and regrettable way. Canadianizing, feminizing, decolonizing waves sweeping across campuses have all met with appeals to excellence, appeals both bigoted and self-serving. More about this later. Some of what I have to say may shock or depress you. I'm sorry about that, but it can't be avoided. However, if you are feeling down at some points or already feel low because of the marathon of life in your bubble, even if you are feeling down at some points, think of something brilliantly creative and unapologetic. Something like Out Saskatoon's recent extravaganza program, which claimed affirmative space even on the riverbank, though there may have been conversion therapists lurking in the bushes. Or think of something more directly connectable to Stonewall, like that wonderful moment at the Biden-Harris inauguration in Washington in January, when Lady Gaga reached down for the golden microphone while seeing and not seeing the homophobic Mike Pence just beside her, and then proceeding to perform an unforgettably fine rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. For those who knew Peter Millard, I'm sure you can readily imagine him in the Peter Mansbridge CBC role, offering color commentary on the ghastly taste on display at Mar-a-Lago, where the homophobe in chief was already installed, before grading Pence and Lady Gaga for clothes, talent, and values, according to the stellar standards of La Cage aux Folles or a Bach cantata. My title for this talk is a declaration of focus and a way of structuring and sequencing the remarks that follow. I will deal in detail with the gay liberation phase in which Peter was so prominent, and deal much more summarily and schematically with the UNDRIP and COVID phases, which we can take up more fully in the discussion period, I hope. I will conclude with suggestions for you to read work already completed during the pandemic and connection to initiatives aimed at bringing post-secondary education back better. And the forms of activism the Canadian Academy needs to shift, the forms of activism the Canadian Academy needs to shift it forward from the neoliberal arts to the liberal and liberating arts with a mobilizing, decolonizing twist. Let's begin then with activism. Activism is neither passive nor merely reactive. The awkward term of relatively recent vintage, proactive, indicates as much, while trying to escape the negative taint of activism in some quarters. Judicial activism, for example, the apparent bane of Stephen Harper's life, led to his ill-fated attempt to smear Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin and bring the Supreme Court of Canada to heel, along with other sources of independent inquiry and opinion. There is still lots of dog whistling going on when the term activist is applied to individuals and social movements today. Fortunately, many wear the term as a badge of honor, refusing to pop their daily soma and accept the status quo in our brave old world. Academic activism is seen by some as, like judicial activism, a contradiction in terms. For some, like academic originalists and members of the Runnymede Society, universities are not political, but objective entities, forts of disinterestedness, cloisters of unworldliness, grounded in unassailable ancient liberties, connected to Magna Carta and all that allegedly derives from it. Others, opponents of academic unionism and student radicalism, mostly, would share the view expressed by Peter McKinnon, after whom, regrettably, the college building has been renamed. In McKinnon's 2018 book, University Commons Divided, Exploring Debate and Dissent on Campus, we encounter the following, quote, "Universities do not exist to pursue social justice or comfort, and they must not have their purpose and activities bent by those more interested in crusades than in the hard work of intellectual life." I'm going to read that again. Universities do not exist to pursue social justice or comfort, and they must not have their purpose and activities bent by those more interested in crusades than in the hard work of intellectual life, unquote. It won't surprise you, but I could not disagree more with the rhetoric of dismissal employed here and with the core claim. Happily, the book had been published before McKinnon made his first public appearance on the Dalhousie campus as interim acting president after his protege, Richard Florizon, vacated the presidency and headed back east as far as Waterloo. Students read the book, cited the passage I quoted and several others like it on posters which they held up silently from different places in the audience while McKinnon introduced himself to the academic community he would lead for a short time. Like Lady Gaga, seeing and not seeing Mike Pence, McKinnon saw but did not see or choose to remark upon the students and their posters with his own recent words written on them. However, unlike Lady Gaga, he failed to manage the meanings of his avoidance of these brave and informed and otherwise non-disruptive students. After he'd stopped speaking, later in the day, as the furore rose, the chair of the Dalhousie Board of Governors made a bad situation worse, assuring the media that those students with the placards either had not read the interim president's book or had failed to understand it. Poor things, infantilized and condescended to again. They clearly needed to get back from engagement and aspiration to the hard work of intellectual life. Alas, McKinnon's views are shared by too many academic leaders, but even more by the rapidly swelling numbers of brand managers and reputation spinners who view any sign of trouble at degree mill negatively, rather than as appropriate signs of life in locations usually densely populated by young people full of hope, excitement, and critique of the world they have inherited from their elders and alleged betters. We need to remember that the opposite of the active life, the vita activa, is not the vita contemplativa or contemplative life, which is in fact the other vita's complement. The opposite is the vita tractabilia, or even obsequens, and rote compliance and obsequiousness, of course, have no place in a healthy university. Being an academic activist is no easier today than 40 years ago, though the instruments for intimidating, silencing, and discrediting dissent are perhaps more subtle and are certainly better resourced than they were when, in my presence, an academic vice president at the U of S spoke of good and bad faculty, meaning the ones on side with administration positions on matters and the ones vocal in their criticism of such positions. Now, in order to clarify what I just said, let's turn to the Millard story. And of course, we do so, we have been living for several years with the enforcement of narrowly prescribed activity at the expense of activism, activity displacing and attempting to discredit activism. TABS, the U of S's transparent activity-based budgetary system, is only now, after a substantial period of demeaning implementation, being considered by University Council for revision. When TAB's introduction was announced, I was still on campus. I asked one of TAB's promoters, since the meaning of terms can be illuminated by considering their antonyms, what would count as inactivity in the proposed new system? I did not receive an answer, even though I helpfully provided potential examples of inactivity, including reading and thinking. However, I am still charmed by the notion of a transparent, activism-based budgetary system. That might even bring me out of retirement. Pro bono, of course, but still the same bad dude. The first time I set eyes on Peter Millard was early summer 1974, just before lunch. He was walking towards the exit of the upper reading room in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, resplendent in white slacks and shimmery silver shirt, with a canary yellow cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders with casual panache, the sleeves intertwined artfully in front. I had no idea who this man was, but I thought, straight out of Brideshead Revisited, or maybe Robert Redford's Gatsby with more than a hint of Christopher Isherwood. The next time I saw him, he was wearing a creme suit and I a pink suit. It was mid-September of the same year, and the head of the English department, Keith Johnston, and his wife Kay were hosting a welcome back party for faculty and staff. And Isabel and I and our infant son were getting our first impression of the English department in full. Lo and behold, there was that man again, and we were now apparently colleagues. Peter was at his charming, witty best, and we were thrilled to have met him. Over the ensuing months, I discovered that Peter had been an undergraduate at McGill before doing a second undergraduate degree at Wadham College, Oxford, the first Oxford college, by the way, to fly the rainbow flag. A college whose master was the celebrated closet dweller, classicist, and nude bather at Parsons Pleasure on the River Cherwell, Sir Maurice Bowra. And that Peter had then come after Wadham to the U of S before returning, with the support of President Spinks, I note, had returned to Oxford to complete a DPhil as part of the more adult and international cohort at Linacre College rather than Wadham. He had clearly taken an intelligent, well-informed gay path through collegial but endlessly coded Oxford. Peter had lived through the Cold War in the UK and then in Canada, and was clearly refusing the three main messages aimed at homosexuality at that time. It was a sin, it was a crime, and it meant you were a blackmailable security risk. Hence all those absconders, hence all those suicides. Peter and I were both born into the working class. His father was a coal miner and mine a ship's rigger. Our mothers were homemakers until the kids were up and at work or away. Peter and I had both done well as undergraduates and then had to navigate Oxford as best we could. He acquired a plummy accent, for which I almost forgave him, to which he could readily add plums if warranted, to ease his way among the toffs and see off the muscular Philistines, while I, at Jesus College, grew the ideological chip on my shoulder to roughly the size of Edinburgh Castle, while retaining my accent, the mark of the beast to the truly refined, Thomas Hardy put it. I did this while alarmingly expanding my vocabulary and literary allusions. Our friendship blossomed in Saskatoon, even as I retained the view that Peter Millard had an overdeveloped sense of the tedious and the hideous. He used beauty and boredom to escape from aspects of a job which he, like me, had decided was his career path, but which he, unlike me, was not going to give all of himself to. But our shared interest in progressive causes softened some of the tensions between us, and we did not pry into areas of each other's lives where we did not belong. He was recently out and proud and determined to change institutional and public views of gay and lesbian people. I was an anti-authoritarian lefty trying to find a radical Canadian footing. Each recognized the other as a capable and trustworthy ally with whom to work intersectionally. And we shared a resolve, rapidly increasing in the English department, to wrest their privileges from the patriarchal pod, or was it a polyp, of fool professors who thought they knew best in matters both great and small. And we both knew we had better be up to academic snuff in terms of degrees, publications, and teachings when the inevitable backlash came, as it did. And this is a key point. If you are an academic activist, insecurely positioned professionally, you're sure to be dismissed as a malcontent and deadwood, and gradually or abruptly shown the door. Thus, in this situation, was born between Peter and I, on the way home from yet another frustrating department meeting, a three-part activist strategy for change: preparation, demeanor, and goals. Preparation, demeanor, and goals. We learned academic procedures inside out. Robert's rules of order were virtually committed to memory, and the ideological distribution of the faculty telephone directory, a hard copy at the time no less, that the ideological distribution of the faculty telephone directory, we went over that and prepared for interventions at the most promising spot on the published agenda. Demeanor was crucial. Be cool, articulate, sit mostly together, but sometimes apart, often silent when expected to explode, effective when least expected. And believe me, that was hard. Peter taught me how to keep it together most of the time, even when outraged. His was always a cold fury, even when, as he began to speak at the meeting of the old plenary council in Arts 143, 3 rows down from us, a colleague from another college suggested loudly to his manly chums, "Give the guy a Playboy. Give the guy a Playboy." Peter heard this pathetic attempt at a put down, but did not miss a beat in his magisterial demolition of the administration position on sexual orientation in the academy. But such experiences took their toll. They accounted for his apparent coldness on occasion and the intensity of his contempt for bigotry and bullies. And this, I think, these experiences also accounted for his resolve to get out of the academy as soon as he could afford to, and his seeking of gratification and a parallel purpose in promoting visual arts and improving local taste through his connections with Fred Mulder, who is doing mostly prints with Colnaghi's at the time. Fred donated the Picasso liner cuts, of course, to the university, as well as depositing others at the Remy Modern. By the fall of 1975, Peter had enlisted my support for Doug Wilson, and I was preparing to testify before the Schmeisser Committee investigating the prevention of the openly gay and definitely activist organizer Doug Wilson from supervising student interns from the College of Education. That, and I was also receiving regular impromptu tutorials from Peter Millard about the status of resistors, gay as well as straight, to a gay rights movement coming to campus. Peter understood the epistemology of the closet, to use Eve Sedgwick's famous phrase, but he also understood the demography of the closet, and he was determined to protect on campus young people often terrorized in their communities across the province. This had to stop. Moreover, it had to be replaced by pride and respect, and exported wherever the challenge was clearest, as when, believe it or not, Anita Bryant was invited to deliver her anti-gay message in Moose Jaw, and Peter led the charge down there from Saskatoon. Peter's mix of charisma and courage was extraordinary, but the backlash, as I've already said, was sometimes intimidating. For instance, when we picketed the spring convocation of 1976, arriving just before the ceremony had concluded, we were a small group of faculty armed with placards and chants, led by Peter in his Oxford doctoral gown with his megaphone in hand. I was pushing Andrew in his baby carriage, while Isabel, slightly ahead, turned and observed me spat upon and cursed by a couple of incensed people leaving convocation with their freshly graduated offspring. And there was huge resentment in the milling crowd outside the auditorium. Not a moment one forgets, even if one tries to. However, undeterred, we chanted on until the crowd dispersed and the surly eminences from the convocation platform had gone away too. Slightly earlier than convocation, there occurred an event at the public library downtown. Michael Swan of Classics and History had arranged a series of public events on great trials and asked me if I would present on the trial of Oscar Wilde. It was too good an opportunity to miss, given a charged climate and public awareness of gay assertiveness. I created a script out of the published transcripts of the trial and then approached Peter and Ron Markin with a proposal. I would frame the exchanges and moderate discussion afterwards if they played Lord Queensberry's defense lawyer, Edward Carson, and the plaintiff, Oscar Wilde. Moreover, would Ron play Oscar and Peter play Carson? Such was the courage and commitment of these friends and colleagues that they agreed immediately to this arrangement. I say courage and commitment because I had already received loathsome reactions to what I thought a fairly anodyne promotional text I had prepared for the event. My mistake, apparently, was setting things up with a famous passage from Macaulay's review of Tom Moore's Life of Lord Byron. It goes like this, quote, "We know no spectacle so ridiculous as the British public in one of its periodical fits of morality. We know no spectacle so ridiculous as the British public in one of its periodical fits of morality." A couple of copies of these texts were appallingly annotated by furious anonymous homophobes and returned to me in campus mail, promising retribution on the day. But Peter and Ron remained unfazed and came through big time with the dramatization of the reality that even the most brilliant of us are vulnerable. Wilde took a congratulatory first at Oxford, and the law of the land may have little to do with justice. For me, this was wonderful. Probably the two most widely known and admired members of the English department I had recently joined, and reversed roles, encouraging empathy and counting on me to set things up effectively. It was a full house and an electrifying atmosphere, with colleagues as gutsy and smart as these two, and a number of other junior colleagues with whom I also worked on activist projects. I was definitely in the right place. One of my strongest bonds with Peter was established on Wiggins Avenue opposite Brunskill School, after one of my earliest experiences of an arts and science college meeting. It had been informative and, as was customary in those days, very well attended. It was also disappointingly drab, given that I had already witnessed some fireworks in such settings and wanted more. Peter and I walked home accidentally afterwards, and I asked him what he thought of the University of Saskatchewan, really. He expressed sincere affection for it, but added that, like most universities, it marched valiantly behind its students on the path to social justice. I expressed my agreement with this assessment, and he then asked me how I would characterize the university. I offered a sardonic response I'd used once before in Birmingham, where I taught the previous year. The modern university, I intoned, is a hotbed of cold feet. A hotbed of cold feet. For good measure, I added that maybe, as with the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, in 16th century Britain, we were witnessing the dissolution of the universities in later 20th century Britain and Canada. Peter's response was instant, and in tones and cadence that Sir John Gielgud would have happily owned. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. This line from Sonnet 73 on the social and individual ravages of time was brilliantly apt. And for Peter, as well as for Shakespeare, the contrast was no doubt overdetermined with homoerotic as well as political meanings. We were quiet for a little, each communing with himself. And then he broke the silence as if summing up a shared epiphany before we parted ways at his house. The problem is, Len, you are an intellectual. Long pause, and then he clarified as I waited apprehensively. But of course, that's not your problem. It's the university's, and it shouldn't be. Activism then was another name for intelligence and vice versa. and I should never apologize for embracing and exemplifying that proposition. I never walk or drive or have driven past that spot on Wiggins without remembering that moment and wondering how I could have better lived up to it. Peter also taught me to take a rest from the coalface when one needed it, or to try a different mine. And that was hugely important. Working in Regina and in Ottawa gave me new sets of appreciative colleagues and interesting institutional opportunities, while my activism seemed to have decreasing impact in my immediate milieu. I gradually realized that well before COVID, my home department was changing from a conflicted but animating community capable of great parties, reassuringly scandalous behavior, serious schism. It was changing to a diaspora where everyone seemed overextended all the time and few thought they could afford to attend department or HRU events. Peter had not shown much interest in the kinds of events I organized for the HRU, but I knew and accepted the reasons for that. He was running an art gallery and deeply involved in the struggle to change human rights legislation in the province, doing his job in other venues, as well as fulfilling his primary obligations on campus. Meanwhile, at the HRU, we went from large and engaged audiences to almost no one from the department showing up for anything. It was time to take my activism elsewhere, while reminding myself that when Peter became chair of the department, it was only after having been blocked from that position, though the majority of voting faculty had supported him. Moreover, he had been ruled out of contention explicitly on the grounds he was openly gay. This by senior figures openly exulting at the Toronto police raids on gay bathhouses. How could anyone forget that? There had to have been deep reasons for Peter repeatedly locking himself out of his office. He wanted to be elsewhere, having accomplished as much as he could on campus as a mentor, tormentor, leader, activist, and trustworthy friend. So after Stonewall, riot, uprising, rebellion, it's been called various things, in New York City started on June 28, 1967. The events occurred in Greenwich Village, an artist-intensive neighborhood, also hosting two private universities, NYU and the New School of Social Research. What was soon to become the gay liberation movement and many offshoots, with centers in New York and San Francisco, and offshoots at places like the London School of Economics, where Peter may have participated. They're best understood in relation to, but not reducible to, student unrest. There were numerous vectors and targets of oppression, and this created the conditions of solidarity through intersectionality. In Montreal, Peter had missed the most exciting times of the late 60s, but his taste in music, his knowledge of clubs, his love of dancing, all suggested to me his having accessed a gay demi-monde in Montreal, a city proudly less good than Toronto the good. He had probably conquered the trepidation of a new immigrant from the Welsh valleys and Somerset, who was gifted enough to win the Shakespeare Prize for the graduating honours student in English with the highest GPA, at McGill, no less. And he had shared with me that eminently portable activist strategy, preparation, demeanour, outcomes, even as I was finding new allies and activist models on campus. Susan Gingell and Louise Forsyth, most notably, and the members of a new group that had just been formed, as the Indigenous Humanities Group, Lynn Bell and Isabel Findlay, two of Peter Millard's most ardent admirers, and Sagish Henderson and Marie Baptiste. And so from gay liberation, the activist front on campus moved to indigenizing and decolonizing. These had been activities already underway since the Second World War, but they gained serious intellectual traction after the Shirk Summer Institute, organized chiefly by Marie Baptiste in 1996. And lots of work since then. In 2007, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was approved by the General Assembly 143 in favor, 13 abstentions, and 36 absent. Only 4 nations voted against: Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. The full sad story is well told in Sagish Henderson's book, Indigenous Diplomacy and the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Achieving UN Recognition, 2008. Here I want to flag key considerations for decolonizing Canada's universities. First, there is the colonial blindness of the national imaginary. The colonial blindness of the national imaginary. Canadians, including new ones, guided by official citizenship literature, are urged to know and take pride in Canada's role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the later consequence of that in world recognition for this country on that file, and the Nobel Peace Prize for Lester Pearson. Things are slowly improving after the setbacks of the Harper years and the Jason Kenney take on citizenship and Canadianness. And we are now beyond talk of aspiration to implementation, not only of the measures recommended in UNDRIP, but in the TRC calls to action and the recommendations of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In addition, Bill C-15 is now before the federal parliament, with some provinces resisting as hypocritically as they can, with Kenney, Moe, and Ford to the fore. But this blindness is not simply a convenient avoidance of a challenge to the national settler brand and the most blatantly racist of our provincial governments. No, it is also a woeful ignoring of the Indigenous practice of 2 defining virtues of an honest broker and multilateralist middle power like Canada: diplomacy and brain power. What Indigenous knowledge keepers and legal scholars have achieved since the late 1940s is one of the great intellectual accomplishments of the late 20th and early 21st century. However, you'd never know that in some political and populist circles where judicial activism is seen as prone to favor Indigenous arguments about treaty federalism, sui generis Indigenous citizenship, the honor of the Crown, the duty to consult, and Indigenous and treaty rights securing free, prior, and informed consent. If Indigenous scholars, if I am right, and many others like me, if Indigenous scholars have accomplished so much in national and international venues, would that not mean that universities would now realize that indigenization is not a remedial inclusion, but an enrichment from other knowledge systems than the Eurosettler one? Law and education have made some progress in these matters, but it's a very mixed picture across campus and across Canadian campuses. In a deeply racist province like Saskatchewan, former Treaty Commissioner and Judge David Arnott was able to go on the public record again recently about the deep roots of Saskatchewan racism, and his remarks went largely unnoticed. Maybe the reports on the RCMP handling of the Colton Bushy murder will change that. But I suspect, and it's a challenge for everyone trying to decolonize our university, but I suspect that many people in this province would be more inclined to erect a statue to Gerald Stanley than to consider relocating a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald. As we await the Supreme Court decision on the federal government's right to put a price on carbon, there are ever more ominous signs of the shift from Saskatchewan as the land of living skies to Saskatchewan as a land of livid guys. I then go on in the paper to enumerate 6 grounds of the great refusal that I've witnessed when in our own campus, 6 attempts, grounds for saying, you know, for example, indigenization is a great idea, but we're strapped for cash, we have no resources, and therefore we have to protect the academic core of the university, or it's a violation, this indigenization and decolonization is a violation of academic freedom, or collegial governance, and on it goes. I won't go on about these now. We may take them up in the discussion period. And very briefly, good grief, noting what the time is. Let me say about COVID. I have spent the last year on a working group struck by the Royal Society of Canada, working on a project investing in a better future, higher education and post-COVID Canada. We just finished the report. It will be out next week, and I urge you to read the report. It tries to defend the key features of the university as we know it, arguing for public reinvestment in public institutions. The role in the public health system should be mapped onto the post-secondary public university and college systems in order that we regain the competencies, remake the conditions for our universities at a moment of extreme peril. Because of COVID, there has been an understandable diversion of faculty attention to the rigors, the travails of moving much of their teaching online. People have had no spare time, no attention to pay to academic freedom, to collegial governance, even while CAUT has had more complaints about academic freedom relating to teaching since COVID than for the previous 10 years. We are at a moment when unilateral managerialism was understandable in the short term, but at this moment, as tuition increases are announced, if you read the last 2 sets of minutes from University Council, you'll see ominous rumblings of a provincial government's inclination to follow the awful punitive lead of Alberta and take it out of the university's hide. That will mean invoking the financial exigency clause. That will mean looking with a baleful Philistine eye at all sorts of areas of the University of Saskatchewan. And what will be needed in response will be collective, intersectional organization, preparation, the development of an appropriate demeanor for making the public case, an appropriate set of demeanors for making the departmental, the collegial, and the institutional case, and a recourse to the particular provisions in the collective agreement. Otherwise, I fear the creeping privatization evident in the past year of COVID, that creeping privatization of crucial aspects of our public institutions will continue apace. And as Jim Turk, former CEO, administrative head of CAUT used to say, the reduction of faculty to newsreaders, the instrumentalization of everything, the pockets of privilege targeted to particular places in the university, and the further Uberization of every other component of the academic labor force on campus. And on that unhelpful and grim note, I think I should shut up for now and welcome questions and comments. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Well, so, thanks very much indeed, Len. Thanks very much for that. So I think we'll move now to the question period. We have a question in the question box already. So Kai is hot off the starting line. And so I'll just mention to folks that the chat has been disabled, but if you want to pose a question to Len, you can do so in the function that says Q&A. So go to that and key in your question, and I will I'll read it verbatim, and Len can respond. So Kai's question is, what are your thoughts about the possibilities for hiring Indigenous, queer, and trans scholars into the English department at the U of S?
Well, no, I'm out of that loop now. However, I feel that there is given history, there is a much better chance of such hirings in the English department than in some quarters. I think that in a way, there should be no need for the question to be asked. It should be absolutely beyond question that the academy should not be there to reflect white bourgeois heterosexual Canadian society back to itself. The university needs to embrace and productively perform a wide range of notions of difference and a wide spectrum, wide spectrum. And we recognize that educational institutions, CAUT has had to do its work on this file. The Royal Society is slowly and sincerely and painfully coming to terms with how that the question impacts on them. The granting councils are doing the same. There is a concerted effort, but in places like the English department, where the thing we study, that is that literature is a place for the performance and the creative imagining of all sorts of differences, the prospects should be good. However, what lies ahead is going to be a selective turning off the tap. What I fear and what I see already indications of is the selective reinvestment in certain parts of the university, ag-bio, for example, engineering. Medicine isn't a good place to argue for its invaluable contributions to society, but there will be a casualization in, I think, or an attempted Uberization, as I put it, of areas in the humanities, fine arts, for example. That is to say, the most, in theory and in prospect, hospitable areas of the university for hiring such as you are inquiring about will be least capable of hiring at all.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much. So we have another question from Andrea Wessel, sort of a comment, and I'll read that and ask you to respond. So I'd like to thank Professor Findlay very much for his lecture. I had the pleasure of working with Professor Millard on a project, and he was an intelligent and creative person. I will not forget him and all the good things that he did. And that's from Andrea Wessel. So actually, Len, maybe I'd ask you to respond to that. Talking a little bit about pedagogy generally, but also that kind of pedagogy that Andrea Wessel is speaking to there, this sort of independent work with students on long-term projects. And what are the possibilities for expanding the kinds of university ideals that you've been talking about through that specific kind of pedagogy?
The funniest thing, Peter taught me all the time, but I never saw Peter teach. I didn't visit one of his classes. And, you know, he had he was marinated in the traditional canon. He knew it back to front. He could quote things. He was fiercely loyal to. He felt that he had particularly when he repeated his undergraduate experience and did a second BA in Oxford, where there's a tutorial system. He recognized what the power of close teacher-student relations can be, and how much both parties can get from extended interaction over a project, as well as from the interactions that go with it. Never having seen Peter teach in an undergraduate class or a graduate class, I imagine he was actually kind of all business in a traditional sense, keeping his charisma in check, though allowing his wit as full a reign as usual. But that the basic commitment was that his chance in life, his career path had been immensely enabled by successful student experience. And he wanted to share that, I think, as broadly as he could with as many students as possible. And in the department, when I came as a newbie, you know, Peter, like Ron Markin, they were surrounded by students all the time. People and I'm in Peter's class, and that was for me a very positive indication. But I suspect there was perhaps an unexpected level of formality about Peter in his teaching that wasn't there in his informal education of people like me.
Okay, great, thanks for that. Okay, the questions are coming fast and furious now. So first we have one from Susan Guignel. I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing her name, and I apologize for that. So you've been a lifelong supporter of freedom of speech, but also advocated for equality on multiple fronts. Within those often viewed as competing concerns, what is your view of the failure to use criminal code sections on hate propaganda to address hate speech following the shooting of Colton Boushey? And also, what is your view on the desirability of reinstituting human rights code sections on hate speech?
Well, it couldn't be more topical. Susan, in a blog on my blog at Ryerson on prairie racism, you'll find my first response to the Boushey murder and an analysis of Brad Wall's comments, an analysis of the RCMP, and an analysis of what Peter Stoichev said on that occasion. I did not explicitly then reference hate speech. I should have. I'm working on a follow-up blog at the moment, and but what the voice is most affected by this to be heard and to be heard again and to be reanalyzed before I turn to this and try to incorporate the hate speech as a ground on which the exposure of the double standard can, that is, that you can attribute the hate speech online to understandable anger, to broader and understandable developments like farmers with firearms, notion, the whole law of trespass, and of course the unfortunately provocative and inciting discourse of the RCMP themselves. So a clutch of allegedly extenuating circumstances, letting haters and bigots off the hook, free from prosecution. This, I think, is clearly the case. I think that lawyer for the family, Murphy has made this very clear. But getting there, I think the argument is going to be made by people with a stronger legal background than me. But I agree that the failure to apply that law, notoriously difficult. We know from the Jim Keegstra and Ernst Zundel cases, protracted litigation, loathsome support for both of those people from people who share their views. And the idea that free speech allows me to hate and to disseminate my hateful views without consequence, without reprisal, is also, of course, the grand conundrum around what we see as social media.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So next we have a question from Lisa Vargo. Hi, Len. It's very strange not to see the others in the audience. Geez, sing it. But nice to see you. And I should like to have a copy of your essay. With respect to undoing colonial injustice at the University of Saskatchewan, how, in your mind, can I be a better teacher and colleague? And that's from Lisa Vargo.
Well, if I say you're already perfect, Lisa, you won't believe me. And I won't say that even at a safe distance. But I think I mentioned Susan Gingerell and Louise Forsyth as people who I saw have the intelligence and courage to speak up in council and in larger assembly situations where the atmosphere is particularly intimidating. In my witnessing of your chairing of the English department, and I presume in your now chairing of art and art history, that I will see the same courage, the same cogency, the same refusal to be silenced that I witnessed in your progress as an academic activist on campus. I think that I never winced when the microphone came your way. I was always eager to hear what you say, and I was impressed by the fact that you got up and spoke truth to power. You spoke, you raised legitimate concerns about the humanities, about the forms of diversity they try to nourish, to value and promote. That you've already done that. And I think that perhaps that the probably, I've no doubt that in your classes, you are promoting this decolonizing agenda. But I hope that when the serious, and I'm sure difficult conversations about what happens after COVID start, that you will be an able advocate. And one of the things you will ably advocate for is for the decolonizing, post-colonial, unsettling agenda that we have all, in our various ways, already taken up and taken some days forward and some days, unfortunately, back.
Okay, thanks. And Lisa also writes in the comments in the questions section here, thank you, Len. Susan and Louise are models to follow. I feel I have a lot to learn. So there you go. Thanks, Lisa, for that. Next question is from Lucy Hinney. Lucy says, greetings from York in the UK, from a fellow Aberdonian. Len, thank you so much for a fantastic paper. I want to ask you from the heart, what can we do? This is a genuine question from an early career researcher and recent postgrad. How do we meaningfully cultivate change in the face of this adversity? A big question, I know, but what would you advise? How do we keep the fire burning?
Well, thank you. Just before Christmas in November, I was in a special panel organized by the College of New Scholars at the Royal Society of Canada. It was a panel on reconciliation in the academy. One of my fellow panelists was Maggie Kovac, who just an Indigenous scholar who had been in the College of Education and had moved to UBC. At the end of the question period, at the end of the panel, a young scholar from McGill asked the same question as you asked. Where do we start? How can we help? And in a sense, Lisa's question too. And Maggie's answer was, well, you can start by showing up. That is, and it's a very simple thing. But I mean, I'll know more. There's all sorts of things going on. The Red Dress Project, the forms of intervention, the kinds of creativity that are there. What you teach, how you teach it, but showing up and showing solidarity when Indigenous scholars, when the agenda of a meeting has something on it or has a serious settler smug absence on it, that is showing up, breaking the silence, making yourself heard, and of course not appropriating Indigenous voices, but fashioning, as some of us have tried to do over the time. My own role is the role of an ethical ally, a role that was I was instructed on by Willie Littlechild from Sturgeon Lake when I examined his MA thesis in the College of Education, showing up, trying to think and asking what would be my most useful contribution in this particular case. And also supporting the work. I mean, I was supervising Tasha Hubbard on her MA Buffalo project. I mean, when she won the Golden Globe for her first major documentary on Starlight Tours and Neil Stonechild. The university wanted to put her up on the website as a poster child. No, here's one of ours. Aren't we indigenizing so successfully? This is before the significant hemorrhaging of Indigenous faculty recently. And I had to help her through this, Tasha through her situation, and also to talk to her as best I could, as she felt that she was going to go do this documentary with the Bushi family. She was going to go at the UN with them. She was going to do all of this, and she's told by some of the top brass in the university, be very, very careful. I think rather than hearing that message, an invitation to self-censorship, an invitation to self-muting, that is that what we have to do is stand shoulder to shoulder with our Indigenous students, Indigenous community members, and help them, and point to if we witness mistreatment, like an Indigenous community member from English River First Nation being shunned by research services when she showed up to express concern about a nuclear dump being proposed from northern Saskatchewan. And they all turned their back on her and Candace and walked away. I didn't witness that, but people who saw it told me. So at University Council, I brought up the shunning of the English River First Nations person. So that what we do is we pay attention, we listen carefully to those who need our assistance, and we try to supply the support that they think. But showing up and learning the power of bodies in assembly in this world, the diasporactive world of distanced and simulated. Zoom isn't bringing a revolution any day soon, but the more that we can kind of gather, the more we recover assembly, and the more we recover our voices in assembly, and just showing up for events that address this will make a difference.
Okay, thanks very much. And Lucy also writes, thank you so much, Len. Are there any more questions? I will, maybe we'll wait just a minute for, I'll pose one question here while we wait for folks if they want to input any last questions as we wind down here. And Len, I just thought I might ask you to reflect a little bit about the kind of international component of what you're observing here. What's the situation in the UK? What's the situation in Australia or New Zealand? And how do you think that compares with what you've been observing over the course of the last 5 years or so?
It's terrifying. The first thing I would say would some good news, Jerry, for a start. Feeling like a Jeremiah here. That the Canadian Academy is the most densely unionized of the sort of Commonwealth in the States. We are the most densely unionized, and we've added places like University of Northern British Columbia, Simon Fraser. We're still recruiting people who will get protection through collective agreements in their academic freedom and tenure language and so much else. Where the places where the liberal arts have become the neoliberal arts in the most alarming ways, like Australia, there is tremendous anxiety at the moment because of their dependency, their addiction to the differential, that is to say, the international student tuition differential, that a lot of in a lot of jurisdictions, the predicament of international student recruitment has exposed public disinvestment So that's one part of the challenge that's going to come. We've had a shift in government. We have, Alberta is the obvious case of an inclination that is, and because of the history of unionization and its prohibition in Alberta, it stands out as anomalous in several respects. Alberta is the closest we have to an equivalent to some of what's happening in the UK, closing down whole departments, in Australia, less so in New Zealand, but into the global instrumentalization and Uberization of academic labor is less evident in Canada. And when we got the problem is the provinces, but the federal government, the commissioning of the David Naylor report on the funding fundamental science created a really good framework that most of the working group reports from the Royal Society at the moment use that as the sort of frame within which the argument is made for particular sectors and categories within the Canadian Academy. But we also have CAUT producing Education for All, and doing so with CUPE, with Public Service Union, with Canadian Federation of Students. So they have mounted a sectoral presence with an argument, which takes the notion which is on the lips of members of Universities Canada, in the granting councils, of inclusive excellence. And it's very important. It sounds good, but the first thing I would say is it isn't reclusive excellence, it's inclusive excellence. And people in the humanities know an awful lot about inclusion as assimilation, inclusion as subordination, inclusion as relocation on a new margin with even more distance from the center. So we have broad communities with credible voices, often competing agendas, all at the moment, something of a choric presence, arguing for public reinvestment. And we also have collective agreements offering enviable protection for contract limited staff, tenured and tenurable staff. So we're in a much better position, I think. But the horror stories coming out of Australia, particularly, the bright ideas from swashbuckling vice chancellors, pretty scary stuff.
Okay, you were being positive there for a second, and then back to the swashbucklers. So fair play on that. So we have a question from Kathleen James Cavan, and then I think we should probably call that one the last question. And so Kathleen writes that I'm curious to know if you think that COVID will be used as an excuse to reduce and weaken collective action in the post-pandemic university.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I think one has to break it down. There will be a general tendency to do this. I mean, despite the uncharacteristic late recantation from Alex Usher, for example, there are a lot of people saying that we need to privatize all sorts of parts of curriculum development, course assignments. I mean, there is a predatory presence of corporate interests claiming to assist the professoriate in the delivery of curriculum and the production of research. So there's lots of interest, lots of lobby there. But when they're looking for savings, the ideology of affordability is writ large on the University of Saskatchewan campus. There are places of almost unbelievable privilege that are awash in money. And the people who are inside, how this works, in my view, the people who are inside these centers, if you're just in a department, you know, you're chopped liver, aren't you in any center? And in those centers, the conditions for the of teaching and research, the support is extraordinary. I don't grudge them it. I would wish it extended to the rest of campus, because the high performance, the strong support and patience about outcomes gives, that is then used as a standard in recruitment, in award of tenure, in promotion. That is the standards that met by the privileged are there and then applied further down as an incentive to begin to deprivilege, to return from tenure and all that it makes possible to an ever expanding academic precariat. That particular moment is already with us in the casualization across the country. When I was chair of the Faculty Association, I asked the simple question: who is doing the teaching on campus this year? A long pause, mutter, complexity, or things are fluid and so on. But that particular, who is doing and what are they getting paid for it? What are the conditions under which they're doing that? So the university is already sneaky and covert about some of this, because pedagogy gets in the way. Pedagogy gets in the way of the university self-promotion. It's all about the research, or it seems to be all about the research. In my study of, in my inventory of mission statements and annual reports from Canadian universities, two words I look for are education and learned, or erudition. The idea that the university is full of learned people. The word learned has vanished from the represented institutional lexicon. Education is there, but it's kind of down there. And what you see from that squeamishness about mentioning things that the public take for granted, that the university is full of educators, and that the university is full of learned people, and the learning will take very different forms. And some of it will seem immediately useful. Others of it will seem laughably arcane, but nonetheless, they all belong in the same place. This narrowing, this distribution of privilege and austerity, the identification increasingly of the university and its brand with particular celebrity high flyers, recruited often to salaries that you and I could hardly believe. Again, at the Faculty Association, you see what the starting salaries are. And the idea that these stars will save us is a form of desperate redemption narrative that has two consequences of depressing the morale of those who are less fortunate within the institution, and also saying, if that depression leads to relatively sporadic and meager research and scholarly work, creative and artistic and scholarly work production, they don't deserve any more money. So what you get is this kind of fueling effect. And in the end, the big thing, people should be assigned already to find, to make the arguments, to demand the public fora in which the university does not acquire for its own, the administration for its exclusive discretion, the process of collegial governance. Council is stacked already with the administrative team, and you have a largely quiescent faculty representation there too. Time to get organized, time to remember Transform Us, time to remember that I was taken to the woodshed over Transform Us. And they were all gloating and saying that's the end of faculty diverting from or dissenting from the university agenda. And then look what happened. The silence of the deans. Bye-bye, President Bush-Vizniak. The Minister of Post-Secondary Education's cell phone melting in his hand as people from across the world said, you went to university, you don't believe in tenure. And so, remind them, it's not a welcome reminder, Kathleen, remind them of the near-death experience of Transform Us. Remind them that the future of diversity and difference in the province has to be aided, celebrated, inflected, complicated by the faculty who see diversity as enrichment and not contamination of an instrumentalist purity.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. I'm showing 3 minutes past 3. We'd hope for a 90-minute session, so we hit that within 3 minutes. So fair play to you there, Len. I'll mention that a number of people have asked for copies of the talk. Susan Gingell, and Kathleen and Jenna. And I'll just mention that Diana has asked in the comments that if you would like a copy of the talk, please comment in the Q&A or email Diana, English.department@usask.ca, and we'll get all that looked after. So, so with that, I'll say thanks very much to Len. This was a memorable lecture, and we're super grateful for your generosity in standing up and doing that. So thanks very much, and thanks very much to everybody for coming out.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Stay strong. Find your spine.
There we go. Okay. Well, on that happy note, I'll declare us adjourned. Thanks very much. We'll see you all.
Thank you.